Imagine stumbling upon an old cabin deep in the Ozark woods, a place so ordinary on the outside, yet hiding a nightmare that would haunt investigators for decades. In 1894, when authorities pried up the floorboards of the Harlow sisters' secluded homestead, they didn't expect to find 19 men chained in the darkness beneath their feet. Men who had vanished without a trace. Men who were never meant to leave. But who were the Harlow sisters? How did three seemingly isolated women manage to lure, trap, and control so many victims? And how did an entire community overlook the warning signs until it was far too late? Tonight, we're diving into one of the most unsettling and whispered about cases in Ozarks history, the story of the so-called breeding cabin and the truth behind the Harlow name. Before we get started, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our deep dive investigations. And let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's step inside the cabin. In the autumn of 1894, in a remote corner of the Missouri Ozarks, local authorities were called to a homestead that would challenge every assumption they held about the nature of depravity. What they discovered that day beneath a modest cabin floor in a hidden hollow would remain one of the most carefully buried crimes in American history. Not because the evidence was unclear, not because the perpetrators were unknown, but because what had transpired in that darkness was so thoroughly at odds with what the civilized world believed possible that the truth itself became unthinkable. 19 men, 19 human beings, skeletal and broken, chained to the ground beneath that cabin. Some had been there for years, others for months. A few had been there since the cabin was built. They were farmers and drifters, laborers and travelers, men who had arrived at the property seeking work, seeking shelter, or simply following the wrong fork in a lonely road. None of them had left on their own terms. The women who held them captive were not monsters in the way monsters are commonly understood. They were not the product of deliberate cruelty, refined and perfected over time. Instead, they were the inevitable outcome of something far more complex and far more terrifying. A systematic isolation, generational inbreeding, and the complete absence of moral constraint. They had lived their entire lives in that hollow with no law, no society, and no voice to tell them that what they were doing was wrong. When the authorities finally understood the full scope of what had happened, when they began to comprehend the years of captivity, the forced labor, the breeding programs, the children born in darkness, the men who had died and been buried in unmarked graves behind the cabin, they faced an impossible decision. Some crimes are too enormous to acknowledge. Some truths are deemed too dangerous to preserve. This is the story of the Harlow sisters and the breeding cabin. This is the account of how a family was allowed to function as a law unto themselves. And this is the chronicle of how, in the end, the truth was systematically buried, not by negligence but by deliberate choice. The Harlow family had occupied the same stretch of land in the Ozarks for nearly 3 generations by 1894. They were not wealthy. They were not prominent. In fact, they were the kind of family that few people noticed because they lived in the kind of place where no one thought to look. The Missouri Ozarks in the latter half of the 19th century were still largely untamed. The Civil War had torn the region apart, leaving pockets of territory where lawlessness was common, and communication with the outside world was sporadic at best. The mountains created natural barriers, the forests created concealment, and the poverty that gripped the region created a culture of absolute self-sufficiency, Families were responsible for themselves. If they succeeded or failed, thrived or suffered, that was their own affair. The Harlow property sat in one of the deepest hollows in the region, a valley so isolated that the nearest neighbor was nearly 5 miles away across difficult terrain. The cabin itself was modest, a single-story structure built from rough timber and mud chinking. The land surrounding it was rocky and poor for farming, but there was a creek with fresh water, and the forest provided game and timber. For a family with no ambitions beyond survival, it was adequately situated. But there was something else that made the Harlow Hollow particularly isolated. The family did not attend the nearest town. They did not attend church. They did not participate in any of the civic or religious structures that held the loosely organized communities of the Ozarks together. They did not marry outside the family. They did not, in any meaningful way, allow the outside world to intrude on their domain. The Harlow family tree, carefully reconstructed by later researchers and historians, reads like a fever dream of genetic collapse. Parents had married siblings. Grandparents had married grandchildren. Cousins had married cousins across multiple generations. By the time of the events we are examining, the family was operating almost as a closed genetic system, a laboratory of inbreeding where the normal rules of human development and behavior had been abandoned. The 3 Harlow sisters at the center of the story, Eliza, Martha, and Constance, were the daughters of this collapsed genetic line. They had been born in the cabin. They had never attended school. They had never been exposed to any systematic moral instruction beyond what their parents had chosen to impart. And what their parents had imparted was a simple philosophy. The family was sovereign. The family was law. Everything outside the family was irrelevant. The sisters ranged in age from their mid-20s to their early 40s when the authorities eventually arrived. They had spent their entire lives in that hollow. They had never been to the nearest town. To their knowledge, they had never seen another woman outside of their own family in any meaningful way. Their understanding of the world outside their valley was purely theoretical. Stories told by their parents, fragments of information that had somehow filtered through the forest and into their isolation. But what they did understand with absolute clarity was work. The Harlow family had prospered, if that word can be applied to their circumstances, through a brutal system of labor exploitation. The isolation of their property meant that they could not easily hire workers from the nearby towns. The poverty of the region meant that when workers did arrive, they were often desperate enough to accept harsh conditions. The family's complete social isolation meant they felt no obligation to treat these workers according to any external moral standard. At some point, historians cannot determine exactly when, the Harlow sisters and their family members began to view the men who came to their property not as workers to be hired and paid, but as resources to be possessed and controlled. The transition from employment to captivity was not sudden. It was gradual. It began with confiscating wages. It continued with restricting movement. It escalated into physical confinement. And then, at some point that remains unclear, it entered a new phase entirely. The discovery of the breeding program was, for the authorities who uncovered it, perhaps the most difficult aspect of the entire case to comprehend or articulate. It was not a hidden crime that had occurred behind closed doors. It was, in a sense, an open program, something the Harlow sisters discussed among themselves without apparent shame or awareness that they were describing something monstrous. The central purpose of the breeding program was reproduction. The Harlow sisters, isolated, cut off from any normal human social contact, raised in a culture that viewed blood relations as acceptable and inevitable partners, had begun to believe that they needed to produce a new generation. But they wanted this generation to consist of children born from outside genetic material, introduced through the men they held captive. In their minds, this was not an act of rape. The concept of consent did not exist in their vocabulary. These were resources. These were tools. These were breeding stock in exactly the same way that a farmer might view cattle. The men were brought into the breeding program deliberately. The sisters selected them not for any quality related to their character or will, but based on perceived physical health and strength. The men who were selected for breeding were separated from the others. They were kept in a small chamber that had been constructed beneath the cabin floor, in a section that was slightly larger than the main holding area. Here they were fed with greater regularity and kept in marginally better condition. Their role was explicit. They would father children with the Harlow sisters. They would do this repeatedly as many times as biological function would allow, until they were no longer viable for reproduction. When the authorities eventually examined the records, the crude calendars and notations that the Harlow sisters had maintained, they found that this program had been operating for at least 7 years before discovery. 7 years of systematic reproduction. 7 years of children being born in a cabin in a hidden hollow, delivered by untrained hands, raised in the same darkness as the men who fathered them. Many of these children died in infancy. The conditions were simply too terrible to sustain life. Nutrition was inadequate. Sanitation was non-existent. Disease moved through the group with the inevitability of contagion in a confined space. The sisters did not mourn these deaths. In their worldview, this was simply the expected outcome. Some survived, most did not. This was the natural order of things. The children who did survive were themselves held in captivity. They had never seen the sky. They had never heard a sound other than the voices of their captors, the cries of other captives, and the occasional sound of animals passing above. Their entire universe consisted of the darkness beneath the cabin floor and whatever happened within that space. The 19 men who were discovered shackled beneath the cabin represented a span of time covering nearly a decade. Some had been there from the beginning of the operation. Others had arrived more recently. A few had attempted escape and had been recaptured, their freedom lasting only days or weeks before the chains were reapplied. Identifying these men proved difficult. Many had no family connections in the region. Many had been travelers with no fixed address, no stable employment, no one who would miss them when they disappeared. A few had family, but those families lived in distant places, back east in other states, places where communication was slow and a missing son or brother might be mourned but not actively investigated. The authorities, working from the fragmentary information provided by the sisters themselves and the broken recollections of the surviving men, began to reconstruct the timeline. The first man had arrived in 1885 seeking work. He had been lured into the cabin with the promise of payment for farm labor. Within weeks he was confined. Within months he had been moved beneath the floor. Others had followed, one at a time or occasionally in pairs, arriving through the summer month when traveling was easier and work was more likely to be available. Some had stayed for months, some had stayed for years. A few had simply vanished into the darkness, had died from disease, malnutrition, or physical trauma, and been buried in unmarked graves in the property. The men who survived bore the evidence of their captivity written into their bodies. They were skeletal, their bones prominent beneath skin that had barely seen sunlight in years. Many were suffering from advanced scurvy, their teeth loose or missing, their skin covered with the bleeding ulcerations that characterize prolonged vitamin deficiency. Some had developed respiratory infections in the damp, filthy conditions beneath the floor. Some bore scars and broken bones, evidence of attempts to escape or of physical punishment. Their mental states were, in many cases, more damaged than their bodies. Men who had been held for years had lost coherent speech. Some no longer understood that rescue was possible, that freedom existed outside the darkness. Some had developed a kind of learned helplessness so profound that even after being released, they had to be physically prevented from returning to the cabin. Their minds had been conditioned, through years of confinement and absolute powerlessness, to accept their circumstances as inevitable. The oldest surviving man, his name was eventually determined to be Samuel Morse, had been held for nearly 8 years. He had been 28 years old when he arrived. When discovered, he was a hollow-eyed 50. He could no longer walk unaided. His mind had largely retreated from the present. He spoke in fragments about things that had happened decades before and seemed unable to process information about his current circumstances. The authorities examining him medically concluded that his mind had simply given up. The trauma of prolonged captivity at that intensity had fundamentally altered his neurological functioning. The youngest survivor was a boy of 17 named Thomas. He had been held for 4 years, having arrived as a 13-year-old, seeking any work that would pay. Unlike some of the others, Thomas had maintained a degree of mental coherence. He could speak, he could think, but there was a quality to his consciousness that suggested it had been damaged in ways that went beyond the merely physical. When questioned by the authorities, Thomas provided them with details about life beneath the floor that would not appear in any official report. He described the systematic brutality. He described the women who came down into the darkness with food that was more often than not rotten or barely adequate for human consumption. He described the children who had been born down there and had never known any world but that one. He described the men who had died from disease and violence, whose bodies have been disposed of in ways that Thomas refused to describe to his interrogators. What made the case against the Harlow sisters ultimately problematic for the legal authorities was the profound challenge that their worldview presented to the entire system of justice. The sisters did not deny what they had done. They did not, in fact, believe they had done anything wrong. In their statements to the authorities, statements that were preserved in the case files and later discovered by historians, the sisters described their actions with a kind of methodical matter-of-factness that was almost more disturbing than any expression of malice would have been. They were not defending their conduct because they believed it was justified. They were simply describing it as they understood it, as the natural and inevitable outcome of their circumstances. Eliza Harlow, the oldest sister, was the primary spokesperson for the group. When asked why they had held the men captive, she responded that the men were necessary for the survival of the family. They provided labor. They provided the genetic material necessary for reproduction. They were resources, no different in kind from the livestock that the family kept, and no more deserving of sympathy or freedom. When pressed on whether the men had consented to their confinement, Eliza responded that the concept of consent was irrelevant. The men had arrived on family property. By doing so, they had subjected themselves to family authority. The family was sovereign. The family was absolute. There was no authority beyond the family that held any claim over what the family chose to do within its own domain. Martha Harlow, when questioned, added details that filled in the gaps in her sister's account. She explained the breeding program with clinical precision. She described how they had selected the men they believed would produce strong offspring. She explained how they had monitored pregnancies and tracked the outcomes. She described the children who had been born, and with apparent genuine sadness, acknowledged the high infant mortality rate. But this sadness was not a recognition of wrongdoing. It was a kind of agricultural regret, the regret of a farmer whose crops fail. What emerged from these interviews was a complete worldview that bore almost no resemblance to the moral and legal frameworks that governed the outside world. The sisters inhabited a reality in which slavery was a natural and necessary aspect of family economics, in which reproduction was something that could be imposed through force, in which the only meaningful category of persons was family, and everyone outside family was simply matter to be exploited for family benefit. The authorities who interviewed them struggled to understand how such a worldview could have developed. The explanation that eventually emerged was that the sisters had been raised in complete isolation, surrounded only by family members, and had been deliberately taught that the outside world was hostile and irrelevant. They had no reference point for normal human relationships outside of family. They had no exposure to any moral or legal system beyond what their parents had established. They had been, in essence, systematically conditioned from birth to view the world exactly as they viewed it. But understanding the origins of the sisters' worldview did not resolve the fundamental legal problem. What should be done with them? How could a criminal justice system prosecute crimes that the perpetrators did not believe were crimes? How could punishment mean anything to women who inhabited a completely different moral universe? The first instinct of the local authorities was to bring immediate charges. The evidence was overwhelming. 19 surviving men could testify. The cabin provided physical evidence. The sisters had confessed in their matter-of-fact way to everything. But as word of the discovery began to spread, resistance to prosecution began to mount from unexpected quarters. The county prosecutor received visits from local officials, from church leaders, from wealthy landowners who understood the implications of the case. The concern that was voiced repeatedly and with increasing pressure was that a full trial would be catastrophic for the region. A trial would mean the details of what had occurred would be made public. The newspapers would carry the story to every corner of the country. The Ozarks, already viewed by the Eastern establishment as a backward and dangerous region, would be forever branded as a place where horrifying crimes could occur and persist for years. The property values in the region would collapse. Investors and settlers would avoid the area. The already fragile economy would be destroyed. There was also a concern that was voiced more quietly, but with no less urgency. What would this case do to the question of family sovereignty and parental rights? The defense that the Harlow sisters had mounted, that what they did on their own family property, with individuals they claimed were trespassing or working for them, was essentially a family matter, touched on fundamental questions about the limits of state authority. If the Harlow sisters could be prosecuted for holding men captive on their own property, what did that mean for the rights of other families? How far did the authority of the state extend into family affairs? These concerns, articulated by powerful figures in the region and the state, began to create a push toward alternative resolutions. One possibility was to have the sisters committed to mental institutions. The emerging psychiatric profession could provide a framework for understanding their behavior as a product of mental illness rather than moral depravity. If they were insane, they could be removed from society without requiring a trial, without requiring the details to be made public. Another possibility was a quiet agreement that the charges would be reduced or withdrawn entirely in exchange for the sisters' agreement to leave the region. They could be given money to relocate to another state, with the explicit understanding that if they ever returned, or if word of the arrangement became public, they would face immediate prosecution. What actually occurred was a combination of both strategies, executed with remarkable coordination and efficiency. The local prosecutor, faced with pressure from above and below, quietly began to discuss reduced charges with the defense. The possibility of a mental health evaluation was raised with the sisters' counsel. The state attorney general's office, kept informed of developments, began to subtly suggest that other cases might be priorities. The newspapers, which had initially carried details of the discovery, began to receive official requests not to publish further information that might prejudice the case or harm the ongoing investigation. By the autumn of 1895, a year after the discovery, the legal process had come to a conclusion that shocked virtually no one who understood the politics of the situation. The Harlow sisters were formally committed to a state mental hospital for evaluation. No trial was ever held. No public testimony was ever given. The case, to the extent that it had become public knowledge, was filed away and forgotten. The surviving men, the 19 victims of the sisters' captivity, were released with minimal assistance or support. Some received money from a discretionary fund established by the county with the implicit understanding that they would not speak publicly about their experiences. Others simply left the region, often unable to articulate what had happened to them, many bearing deep psychological wounds that would affect them for the rest of their lives. In the decades that followed, the story of the Harlow sisters and their breeding cabin gradually disappeared from public consciousness. The files were archived. The newspapers that had carried the story were discarded. The men who had survived bore their scars silently, most eventually relocating to distant places where no one would ask them about their past. The Harlow sisters themselves lived out their remaining years in an institution in a distant part of Missouri. Their names recorded in administrative records, but their story never fully told, never fully understood by the medical professionals who cared for them. They died eventually without ever expressing remorse or recognition that they had done anything other than what they believed was necessary. The cabin in the hollow was destroyed in a fire in 1902, a fire that was officially attributed to an accident, but which many historians suspect was deliberately set to remove the final physical evidence of what had occurred there. In the early decades of the 20th century, as the country modernized and the Ozarks gradually became less isolated, a new generation grew up in that region without knowledge of the case. The hollow where the cabin had stood was reclaimed by forest. The graves of the men who had died beneath the floor were lost to time and undergrowth. The story became, if it was remembered at all, merely a rumor. A story that people told themselves about something terrible that had happened years ago, back when things were different, back when justice moved according to different rules. But the truth remained, preserved in scattered documents, in the fragmented memories of the surviving victims, in genealogical records and state institution files. The truth was that in 1894, in a remote corner of the Ozarks, a crime of almost incomprehensible scope had occurred. That crime had been systematically hidden, not out of incompetence, but out of deliberate choice. The powerful had decided that the truth was too dangerous to acknowledge. They had decided that the victim's pain was a worthwhile sacrifice to protect the region's reputation and the system of family sovereignty that allowed such abuses to occur. The Harlow sisters' breeding cabin represents a threshold moment in American history. It is the point at which our society was forced to confront the reality that complete isolation, generational inbreeding, and the absence of external moral constraint could produce a worldview in which slavery and systematic violation were understood as normal operations. It is the moment when authorities made a conscious choice to bury the truth, to prioritize institutional stability over justice. And it is ultimately a reminder that there are crimes so profound that we might choose to forget them, but forgetting does not make them less real.